Hi friends, thank you for downloading today's podcast. Be sure to check us out on the web at www.thesceneshow.com, where you can find our blog and find new exclusives and new offers to you, the listeners. Don't forget to check us out, and be sure to, if able to, consider donating to The Scene Show. And in order to help us out, in order to offer incentives to guests and buy new equipment and things of that nature, 100% of your proceeds will go back into the show. And thank you for listening. We hope you enjoy today's broadcast. And welcome to this edition of The Scene Show. Great to be with you here on Monday, March 7th, 2022. Hard to believe we're in 2022, but hard to believe we're this far into the year. But nevertheless, we are, and great to be with you here. And speaking of things we're so far into, I'm amazed that we're so far into this series and into this history of Christian thought, this survey. And episode 21 of The Scene Show. And really, I think, I've mentioned the mantra that our purpose here is to edify, encourage, to edify, educate, and encourage the body of Christ. And really, The Scene Show has kind of become the educational part of that, the educational wing, if you will, of my podcasting abilities. If you want the more devotional sort of content and more of the interview typed content, check out my other podcast, or our sister show called Behind the Scenes, where we do just that. We do theological reflection, spiritual material, things on spirituality, things to, again, to encourage and edify you in your daily walk with Christ. That's available on YouTube. It's available on Podbean. I have not gotten it out to the major distributors yet, but I am working on that. That is to come, and that will be very shortly. So today what we're talking about in our series is we're getting into Scholasticism. This is Scholasticism Part 1. Just to sort of serve as a general overview of Scholasticism, what it is, and to get into two of the early scholastic thinkers, Anselm, mostly St. Anselm, and then Peter Abelard. And we'll look at their influence on the development of Christian thought and scholasticism in particular. Maybe you've heard the term scholasticism, and of course, if you've heard it, it's probably in reference to scholasticism's greatest thinker, St. Thomas Aquinas, who we'll look at in the next episode. But what scholasticism is it's this great revival of theology beginning in the 11th century around the newly founded Mendicant orders here. Think Dominicans and later the Franciscans, and around the universities at Paris and Oxford. And scholasticism pushes the emphasis on rationality to new heights. Now, there's always this sort of, I guess, theology is by its nature, by definition, this intellectual speculation about God, more in the academic sense, whereas spirituality deals with our relationship with God. So there's a little bit of a distinction there between theology and spirituality, but certainly the two overlap. And there are really three characteristics that come to define scholastic thought. And that is the emphasis on logic and rationality is number one. And we've already mentioned some of that. And really, I think this is where we see the birth of faith and reason We talked about faith and reason a while back on the show. We did that series, if you recall, on Fides et Ratio, the more recent encyclical by John Paul II. And this is really the historical roots, I would say, of where faith and reason becomes so intertwined with the Catholic tradition and Catholic thought, as being the two pillars of Catholic theology, of faith on the one hand, divine revelation, and reason, what can be known by reason alone, or what can be known not by reason alone, but what can be known through reason. It's like the two books that God has given us, the book of faith being the scriptures and tradition, and reason being what we know through reason, and they don't contradict one another. This is kind of the hallmark, if you will, of Catholic thought and Catholic theology, is this relationship between faith and reason. And really, I think Scholasticism is again where we see this come to the foray of Catholic theology. I mean, it was always in the tradition from the patristic period, as we've seen. We've seen it in the patristic period. It's always been there. But this is kind of where it becomes enshrined, if you will, and becomes the hallmark of the new university system through Catholic Europe. Now, so I mentioned the emphasis on logic and rationality being the first pillar of thought that we've looked at. The second is the role of non-Christian philosophies to Christian thought. And that's really going to become, I suppose that's really, that really becomes a hallmark of scholasticism, is that how do we deal with non-Christian philosophies, and like Aristotle. And Aristotle gets rediscovered in the 13th century. There's this rediscovery of Aristotle, and of course St. Thomas Aquinas is going to refer to him constantly as the philosopher. If you ever read the Summa Theologica, he's constantly referred to as the philosopher. And then the third sort of hallmark or pillar that we want to put forth is an emphasis on a style of teaching and writing that sought to commentate on past theologians and philosophers. And notably, of course, is St. Thomas's style of posing questions and providing the most logical answers. So, again, it's very logical and reasoned. The effort was to re-examine every point of Christian theology in light of the recently rediscovered philosophy, and thereby show that Christian truth was superior to all other worldviews. So, it's, again, this close relationship between faith and reason, between theology and philosophy, divine revelation on the one hand and reason on the other. If you want an introduction to this, check out our earlier episode on Fides et Ratio and what we did there. But scholasticism is not a monolith of thought. The scholastics disagreed heavily on various theological issues. And Olson gives the example of Aquinas and Anselm disagreeing regarding knowledge. Anselm was skeptical of the senses, but Aquinas, in his view, said that the input from the senses, was the stuff, if you will, quote unquote, the stuff of logic, that it was dependent upon the input from the senses. So it was very much a what we would call realist epistemology in philosophical terms. And we will see a pushback against scholasticism by various Catholic thinkers like Erasmus of Rotterdam, who criticized it as being too intellectual, dry, and irrelevant to the spiritual life. And then Luther will call it that great whore which seduces theology into useless and absurd speculation. So Luther did not mince words, and that's what I find fascinating about Luther. And so that's sort of a brief introduction to scholasticism. Remember, we have the three pillars. We have the emphasis on logic and rationality. We have the role of non-Christian philosophies to Christian thought, particularly Aristotle. And then we have the emphasis on a style of teaching and writing that sought to commentate on past theologians and thinkers, notably Thomas's style of posing questions, providing the most logical answers. So it's that university style of teaching that we don't see in, say, Augustine or in his writings. And so that's sort of the brief introduction to what scholasticism is. And then we get into talking about the scholastic thinkers. And one of the most notable was St. Anselm of Canterbury, born in 1033 and died in 1109. So that's kind of where we're at historically in terms of dates, if you're a dates person, like I am. He's known for his famous ontological argument for God's existence. But he also contributed a revolutionary way of understanding Christ's atoning sacrifice, and we're going to get into that. We're going to talk about what his view of the atonement is and how it changes Christian thought. Now, Anselm is made in 1093 against his will. He's elevated to the position of Archbishop of Canterbury, a position he did not want, but it's one of the most prestigious positions in Western Christianity. And he doesn't want it, but out of his vow of obedience, he obeys the Pope and takes the position. And he will hold that position till he dies. Or no, he dies in retirement. I'm sorry. He does step down eventually. But during that time as Archbishop of Canterbury, he writes Cur Deus Homo, Why God Became Man, and that's his famous work on the atonement. And Augustine heavily influences Anselm's theology, especially when it comes to the questions of predestination and free will. So you see that Augustine is still, remember from that episode we did a couple of weeks ago, Augustine is still heavily influencing and will heavily influence the scholastics as well. So it's not just, and we'll see in Aquinas that Aquinas really takes and synthesizes, Aristotle and Augustine and all of the theology before him, and really puts it out there. So we'll get into that next week. Now, so here's the ontological argument that Anselm formulates, and he formulates this over two books of philosophical theology, or two works of philosophical theology, the Monologian and the Prosologian. And what it says is that, I should back up for a minute and say that he formulates this from logic. He doesn't appeal to sacred scriptures. And in part he's doing that because he seeks to answer some, I don't know if you'd say skeptics, but certainly there was a wave of skepticism. You had critics from the Jewish and the Islamic traditions. And so he seeks to provide a rational account of Christian belief. And where he starts is a conversation that he has with another monk on the passage from the Psalms that says that the fool says in his heart that there is no God. So he contemplates this of how is it possible that the fool could say in his heart that there is no God. And so the ontological argument is based on the premise that nothing can be conceived of as being greater than God. or God is that which is nothing greater can be conceived. And he uses Platonic and Augustinian ideas to show that mankind adheres to varying degrees of perfection and goodness. God is that which is supremely good and supremely perfect. So that's sort of the basis of the ontological argument. The ontological argument is saying, again, that nothing greater than God can be conceived, and therefore God must exist in reality. Now, he gets accused by especially his contemporaries. The contemporary monk Canillo wrote his work against Anselm on behalf of the fool. He's, accused of word games and accused of by his critics of word games and sort of, playing with words kind of a thing. But most scholars, even though they may not agree with the argument, agree that Anselm is more logical than his opponents. And so that's sort of the ontological argument. He says a little bit about God's nature, and the basics is that God acts but is never acted upon. That's sort of the hallmark, again, of scholastic theology. And then there's Anselm's theory of the atonement. And the atonement is simply a way of saying reconciliation, and refers to the act of Jesus on the cross as it relates to human beings, and vice versa, as human beings relate to Jesus on the cross. And it's often called the satisfactory view of the atonement. It says that Christ essentially paid a debt that humanity owed to God because of disobedience but could not pay. Now, some theologians disagree with this model, but Olson says it holds true despite its flaws, and that's what makes it appealing. And what he uses, I believe, this feudal idea of being indebted to a lord or being indebted to someone above you and not being able to pay it. And then later on in Christian thought, John Calvin will use it to form the penal model of the atonement, which is the same thing without sort of the feudal overtones of it. And so that's his theory of the atonement. That we owed a debt, that basically we owed a debt to God that we could not pay. And so, Christ in his deity is able to pay it. And it goes through and it upheaves, and I didn't put this in my notes, but it upheaves the understanding up to that point of the atonement. And you had Pope Gregory's understanding of the atonement, which is basically that God is this robber and has to steal from the devil, and Anselm rejects that entirely, saying that God couldn't be a thief, and he does successfully refute that, and this theory of atonement will replace that understanding, and it is still influential today, in that it is the conservative Catholic understanding of the atonement. Still, it is still the as far as I know, it's the Catholic understanding of the atonement, how we could say that. And most conservative Protestants also accept this. Now, I wanted to say a little bit about Peter Abelard. And I didn't write as much down in my notes as I did for Anselm, but Abelard is a contemporary of Anselm, and he disagrees with his model of the atonement in favor of what he calls the moral theory of atonement, which focuses simply on God's love rather than God's wrath. And it gained popularity it gained new life through more liberal Protestant thinkers. But by and large, in the Catholic world, it's been rejected. As I don't believe it was officially declared a heresy, but it was. But it's certainly not the accepted viewpoint. And Abelard was a very charismatic personality, and he ends up having an affair with this woman, and he's often remembered and thought of for that. But he's, very much a contributor to the scholastic thinkers, to scholastic thinking, and scholastic philosophy and theology. So it's important to note again that in this period that philosophy and theology are very much married together. And we're going to look at how that relationship kind of falls apart with the Protestant Reformation and Luther and Calvin. They reject philosophy, although as Olson notes, they're still influenced by it. They're still influenced by the scholastics, and he says that Luther has to wrestle with scholasticism, and he has no choice because that's how predominant it is. So in any case, Anselm and Abelard sort of lay the groundwork of medieval scholasticism for its crown jewel that was yet to come, as I put it. And St. Thomas Aquinas is that crown jewel, and it is his thought that we will turn to on next week's episode. And so I want to say a couple of things in closing about next week's episode. That I know if many of you probably noticed that there was no Song of the Week last week, and that is because basically because I'm running into issues with copyright laws and copyright, not wanting to get in trouble for copyright claims. And so, by all means, if anyone has any advice on that, feel free to shoot me an email and let me know how to go about doing that legally. But so all of the songs that were either written by me or they were in the public domain, and so they're usable at will. But if it's copyrighted, then we can't play it, and so that's sort of why that segment was not available last week, and it will be postponed until further notice, until I can figure out how to play copyrighted music and do it legally. Still working out the details of that, still working out, the different things with the podcast and that sort of thing. And again, if you like the show, if you like what you're hearing, then please feel free to consider donating. Or if you can't donate, then I would just appreciate your prayers. Of course, your prayers are always welcome and certainly appreciated. And then if you really like what you hear and you'd like to be a part of the show, please, again, send an email and let me know. I would love to have more guests for the Behind the Scenes show, our sister podcast. That's where all of that is going to take place. And so if you'd like to be a guest, again, please send an email. Visit our website at www.thesceneshow.com. And just have a blessed week. And the other thing I want to mention real quickly is that next week's episode will not come to you on Monday as it normally does. It will come on Wednesday. And that's because I will be on retreat for Monday and Tuesday. And so won't be able to put the episode out until I get back on Wednesday. And we will have then Scholasticism Part 2, looking at St. Thomas Aquinas and what we can make of his theology and philosophy. And of course, how to cover St. Thomas in one episode. You can have a whole series dedicated to him. As you could many of these topics that we've gone over, they could easily have, we're just kind of skimming the surface of material here. But so thank you again for listening to me today, and just I will be praying for you, and have a blessed week. God bless.